all of you, and welcome back for those who were here yesterday or day before yesterday, and are day before yesterday. And for those who are coming for the first time, welcome to IISER Pune and to this seminar of Professor Jerry Coyne of University of Chicago. Jerry is an intellectual, a thinker, experimentalist, biologist, evolutionary biologist, and also a science communicator, and one of the excellent science communicators. That's why he's also very famous amongst the non-scientists. One of his books, which the topic of yesterday's talk, Why Evolution is True, was a New York bestseller list for several weeks after it was published. And even today, it's considered as one of the bestsellers, at the same lines as books of Richard Dawkins or Jared Diamond. Many of you may have come across his name and books. So he doesn't need much introduction. People who have come here already have read about him, and that's why you are here. And amongst the many things he talks about, one of his favorite talks is about free will, and which is somewhat more abstract and philosophical in many people's mind, compared to, let's say about DNA or about, neuron, for example, in the brain. Is still very difficult for many people to understand cognition and consciousness, and particularly in the context of human brain. Although we think we understand our brain, and that's why we communicate, very often what we think and what we communicate and how we think and how we communicate is all sort of muddled up because of the language problem very often. And so here is Professor Jerry Coyne, who can sort of enlighten us a little bit about our own brain. Jerry.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes? Thank you for coming out on Saturday. I realize this is a day of rest, so I appreciate your presence. What I'm going to try to do in this lecture is tell you that one of your most cherished beliefs, something that is so strongly held by you that it's almost part of your mind, is wrong, and it's an illusion. And at the end of this lecture, I hope that I'll have at least helped you question that illusion, if not dispel it completely. Now, maybe you're thinking that I'm talking about God, but no, I'm talking about an illusion that's held by everybody in the world, not just religious people. And that illusion is that you have free will. And I'll define what free will is. The question is, Samuel Johnson, back in the 18th century, was the first person to express this dichotomy, that what we know about how the mind works tells us that we don't have free will, but our experience is that we do. So, in other words, we have an illusion in our mind about how it works, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about why that is an illusion and what we're supposed to do about it when we realize that it is. So this is the outline of the lecture that I'm going to give. First of all, what do I mean when I say free will? I have to define it. Second of all, I'll give you evidence that the belief in this kind of free will is actually ubiquitous throughout the world. Third, we don't have that kind of free will, and I'll adduce empirical evidence that it is an illusion and that it's wrong. I'll talk about, and that determinism is the rule. In other words, I'm going to try to convince you that you are robots that are ruled by the laws of physics and that you cannot make real choices in the sense that I'll define in a minute, and that we're ruled by the determinism of the laws of physics. And then I'll talk about some misconceptions about determinism. People don't think very clearly about it sometimes. And then I'll talk about the way that people who can accept determinism, philosophers, nevertheless say that, well, we still have a kind of free will. It's called compatibilism. And I'll tell you what forms that takes, and I'll say that it's bogus. I'll try to convince you that this way to try to unite free will and determinism is a useless endeavor. It's basically a semantic endeavor. And finally, I'll try to end on a positive note, showing you that why, when we reject free will, it actually can have positive consequences, not just for society, but for you as a person in your everyday life. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What do I mean by free will? I didn't even wasn't even interested in this topic until I read a paper in PNAS by Anthony Cashmore, who's a biochemist at Penn in the United States, and he wrote a paper in PNAS about free will, and the first line was something like, "You don't have any more free will than a bowl of sugar does." And that took me aback, and then I read the article and I became convinced that he was in fact correct, that we don't have free will, and this is what he means by free will that we don't have. It's defined as the belief that there is something to our behavior that is more than the unavoidable, ineluctable consequences of the genetic and environmental history of the individual and the possible stochastic laws of nature. In other words, free will is the belief that we can behave in ways that are not determined by the laws of physics that govern the material processes of our body. An alternative definition, and this is the way most people think of it, is if we could replay the tape of life and go back to any moment in our lives with every electron and particle in the universe in exactly the same position at that moment, we could have decided differently. That's how most people conceive of free will. That at any moment when we're at the ice cream store and trying to choose flavors, that we could have chosen this one or that one. And in fact, that's not true, as I'll try to convince you. There's only one thing you could have done, and that one thing is determined by the laws of physics. We could have decided differently, and that decision was up to you. It is possible that if quantum mechanics, which is fundamentally indeterministic, ruled our behavior, then we might have behaved differently in the same situation. But that doesn't give us any free will. It doesn't give us any agency. It gives the agency to the laws of physics. Okay, so the sort of philosophical and biological study of free will is divided into several segments. First of all, there's the dualists. These are people who believe that behavior is independent of the laws of physics, that the mind is basically independent to some extent of the brain, and then we can overrule the laws of physics in our brain and make different choices at any given point. And these people are called dualists because in one part, you have a physical part of the brain that obeys the laws of physics and helps us breathe and our heart beats, but then there's another part which actually makes decisions, and it's somehow physically separate from the rest of the brain. And then there's the determinists, which include people like me, that every part of our brain and behavior is ruled by the laws of physics, either the deterministic laws of physics or perhaps some quantum indeterminacy. And this is the area that science buttresses. There's no evidence for any kind of dualism in our brain, that we have some part of the brain that's physically independent of the rest of the workings of our brain. The evidence is our brain is an integrated system that obeys the laws of physics that are instantiated in behavior. Now, once you're a determinist, and I think that you have to be a determinist if you have a scientific attitude about behavior, there's two stances you can take. You can be an incompatibilist, which is what I am, which says that if this is true, if our bodies and brains are governed by the laws of physics, then we don't have free will. Okay? That free will and physics, or the laws of physics, are incompatible. But then there are people, misguided people, called compatibilists, who think, well, yes, our behaviors are indeed determined and we can predict them in advance if we had perfect knowledge, but nevertheless, we still have a kind of free will. It's an attempt to save our self-image by making up a new form of free will, and I'll talk to you about some of the problems with this later. That's what I am, and that's the point of view that I hope to convince you for the rest of this talk. Okay, first of all, I'm not going to bash religion very much in this talk, but it is important to talk about religion when you talk about free will, because free will, in the sense that I talked about, that you can do otherwise free will, is an essential component of many religions, and certainly of all the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, in several senses. First of all, you have to be able to have a free choice about how you believe. If you're a Christian, for example, you have to choose whether you accept Jesus as your Savior or not. In America, we're constantly besieged by people knocking on our doors, asking us this question. And your fate in the afterlife is determined by whether you make the right decision or not. This presumes that you have the ability to freely decide what to believe for a given religion. Second of all, at least in Christianity, and also some other religions, free will is an essential part of explaining why evil exists. When you ask yourself, well, in a world that's ruled by a benevolent God, why do people kill each other and hurt each other? That doesn't seem to comport with the nature of God. And the answer to that theologians give is, well, God gave us free will. And that's his gift to us, and we can do what we want with this free will. We can behave good or badly. If we behave well, we get rewarded. If we behave badly, we burn in hell. And that's the explanation for why there's evil in the world. It's an unfortunate byproduct of free will. So that's another argument that's frequently made by theologians. And finally, free choice is imputed to certain sins, like homosexuality, which is a sin in many religions. And if it's a sin, it means that you could have chosen not to do it. So the element of free will is essential in the concepts of sin and evil in religion. And the belief that homosexuality is a sin, well, I'll just give you some data. This is just for Islam. This is a Pew survey from 2013. And these are, I think, something like 35 Muslim majority countries. And in each country, the Pew surveyed whether or not homosexuality was a moral behavior or not. And the light green are the percentage of people that say it's immoral. The dark green, no. And you can see that usually somewhere between 80 and 90% of the Muslim inhabitants of these countries say, yes, homosexuality is a sin. Well, this is also largely true in the United States, although not as pervasive as in Islam. If you say it's a sin or it's immoral, that implies that you could have chosen not to be a homosexual. In other words, this kind of moral judgment presupposes that we have the ability to choose how we behave. And in the case of homosexuality, we have the ability to choose which sex we're attracted to or which sex we copulate with. Okay, so that's the definition of free will. Now, how pervasive is it? A lot of philosophers will say nobody believes in this kind of free will you're talking about. But the fact is that we all do to some extent. At least we all feel like we do that. When we go to a restaurant, we look at a menu, we have the idea that we can choose whatever we want, even though that choice is probably determined well before you actually go to the restaurant. So here's an experiment in which they decided to survey the several populations to decide whether or not they agreed with free will. And this is the question they asked them. It's the study of sarcicity and all. Imagine a universe A, in which everything that happens is completely caused by what happened before it. A completely deterministic universe. This is true from the very beginning of the universe. So what happened right at the Big Bang causes what happens next, and so on right up to the present. So once the Big Bang happens, then everything else is predetermined. If you're a physicist, you'll know that there's some quantum mechanical exceptions to this that make things, that if quantum mechanics truly is a non-deterministic phenomenon, that things are not 100% determined at the Big Bang. But in terms of our choices, the question is whether our choices are affected by quantum mechanics or not. And even if they are, that's not part of our own conscious will. That's just some random accident in the neurons in our brain. And most neurologists don't think that quantum mechanics plays a role in choice anyway. So anyway, this is the universe that you're asked to imagine. And the example is that John goes to have French fries at lunch. I guess here it would be whether you have chapatis or rice. And like everything else, this decision was completely caused to what happened before it. So that if everything in the universe was replicated right up to the moment John was at lunch trying to decide what to eat, he would always decide to have the French fries because that decision was determined by his brain, which obeys the laws of physics. The laws of physics are deterministic, and therefore when John made his so-called choice, he had no choice. It was the molecules in his brain that actually made the choice for him, okay? So this is, people are giving a choice between the two kinds of universes they accept. This is the first one, deterministic universe. And then here's the second universe, universe B, which is one that has libertarian free will. So imagine another universe in which the same thing happens. Everything is determined by what happened before it, except for human decision making. So here we have the dualism, that part of our brain is immune to the laws of physics and can be manipulated to make different decisions. So for example, if you have a universe in which Mary decides to have French fries at lunch, and you rewind the universe right up to the exact point of that decision, she could have decided to have something else. And usually it's a salad, right? I mean, this is the choice you get between good foods and bad foods. So we were faced with two universes, one in which you're always going to choose the same thing, because I use the word choose as lightly here because you really couldn't have a choice. And second of all, you could, even if everything was exactly in the same situation, you could have chosen something different. Those are the two choices that people are given. And then the researchers went to 4 different places in the world, and they asked them, which universe do you think we live in? Universe A or Universe B? Which of the universes do you think is most like ours? The deterministic universe A or the libertarian dualistic universe B? And this is the proportion of people in 4 areas that think that we live in the libertarian indeterministic universe B: the United States, India, Hong Kong, and Colombia. And the results are pretty much the same in all 4 places. Anywhere between 60 and 85% of people think that we live in a universe in which we can make free choices, even if the situation was the same. And this is the feeling that we all have. When you go to a restaurant, you think you make a choice. I think I make a choice, but I'm trying to tell you that this is wrong. Right now, I'm just trying to tell you that this feeling that we have an agency is widespread in the world. It's not just, a fiction that philosophers can attack conveniently. So most people are libertarian dualists. Are you with me so far? And then they ask them this question: well, in universe A, the deterministic one, is it possible for a person to be fully morally responsible for their actions? Okay, if you kill somebody, are you morally responsible for that in the world in which things are determined? And there's the answers again in the 4 areas, and they're no. You can see the proportion of people that answer that question no is anywhere between about 60% and 80%. So most people feel that if we live in a universe in which everything is determined by what happened before it, that then the idea of moral responsibility is meaningless, that people are not morally responsible for their actions. Okay? And that makes sense. If we don't really have a choice to be good or bad, then how can we decide whether to behave morally or immorally? That only makes sense if what we do conforms to what society considers morally or immorally, but we ourselves don't have the choice to behave one way or another, which is what I'm trying to tell you. This does not mean, by the way, that people should not be punished for doing bad things, and I'll talk about that in a minute. My view is that we are responsible for our actions, in the sense that if I hurt somebody, that there is an identifiable human being named Jerry Coyne that hurt somebody if I punch somebody in the face or shoot them or kill them. I'm responsible. And therefore, what should we do about that? Well, I should probably be punished and put in jail, and I'll tell you why that is. But I'm not morally responsible, because the concept of moral responsibility, as most people recognize, comes along with the idea that we can choose how to behave at any minute. That is, I could have chosen to kill somebody or not kill somebody, okay? But I couldn't have. And that's what I'm trying to tell you in this lecture, that criminals, just like everybody else that has behavior, have no control, conscious control over what they do. And we have to take this into account when we decide how to deal with people that behave well or badly. So this is my view, that we are still responsible. We need to be punished or rewarded, but in different ways than we do now. Okay, so now, that's the way most people view determinism. Why am I trying to convince you? What is the evidence that this is the kind of world that we live in, world A, in which everything is determined before it? Well, first of all, it's just the laws of physics. We are material entities. We're made up of atoms and molecules, and so are our brains. And our brains have to obey the laws of physics because everything in our brain obeys the laws of physics. So even from first principles alone, we can see that determinism is the case. There's nothing that we could do to change the laws of physics that are acting in our brain. In other words, there's no dualism. There's no unit or module in our brain that's separate from the laws of physics and then can change them and therefore change our behavior. Second of all, there's lots of experiments now. These are very interesting experiments showing that decisions are made before we're conscious of having made them. In other words, our consciousness merely reflects what has already been decided in our subconscious by our brains, our meat computers, as I call them. And finally, I'll talk very briefly about other experiments that show that that your sense of will and your consciousness are material phenomena and not somehow nebulistic, immaterialistic ones. So here's one, this is an experiment, I'm just going to explain in a little bit of detail, which was done just a couple of years ago, about how decisions are made before we're conscious of having made them. So what happens is that a person sits in a chair in front of a computer screen, and then these screens are flashed in front of them at the rate of 1 per second. Each screen has 4 numbers at the corners, and then in the middle, there's another number, and then a letter. And you're trained what to do before you actually do this experiment. So what happens is that at some time, you make the decision whether you want to perform an act of addition or subtraction. That's the binary decision that you get to make, whether you're going to add the numbers or subtract them. And at the point that you make that decision, you're just supposed to sit there and think, and then say, okay, I'm going to decide. At that moment where you make the decision, you remember the letter that's in the center of the screen when you make that decision. Okay, in this case, it's Z. And so let's say you decide to subtract at that point. Then you have to subtract the next 2 numbers in the middle from each other, the smaller from the larger. And remember, this goes by at once a second. So you have to have some training in order to do this experiment. But after a while, you get trained. So you get 6 in 1 second, and then 1 second later, 2. And since you've decided to subtract, the next number you come up with is 4. And when that number comes up on the screen, then you have to press the button of the 4 numbers in the corner. You press the one that corresponds to the number that reflects subtraction. So by pressing this button, you have told the experimenter what decision you made back there, which was subtraction. Okay. If you pressed 8, that button there, then you would have told the experimenter that your decision that you made back here was to add. The good thing about this experiment is it's done without any mechanical preparation at all, so you're not preparing your mind to press buttons or anything until you get to, you've finally made the decision and your decision has been rendered. Then you have one more thing to do, and that's to press the button which corresponds to the moment you made the decision. So you have to remember that you made the decision to subtract when Z was on the screen. Okay, so here we have all the information the experimenter needs. You have a rate of change. You have a moment at which you made a decision, add or subtract. Remember, this is a binary decision. It's not a complicated one. And then you have, so that by knowing this, then the experimenter knows when you made that conscious decision, and he also knows which decision you made. Okay. So you think, well, I decided to add or subtract right there. But if you actually do scans to the brains of somebody that does this experiment, you find out that you can predict what they did before they were conscious of having done it. And here's the brain scans. These are fMRIs, so they're very crude. They're not perfect predictors, but by testing people beforehand, before they do the experiment, you can tell what brain pattern is associated with deciding to add or subtract. And then you see what brain pattern arises in their consciousness, in their subconscious before they do the act. So here's a scan of time. Time 0 is when they say they've made the decision to add or subtract, and there's the seconds before and after that. If you scan the brain beforehand, you can predict with 60% accuracy whether they're going to add or subtract up to 4 seconds before they're conscious of having made that decision. And you can do this in both the posterior cingulate and the medial frontopolar, and other parts of the brain like the angular gyrus, you can post-dict. That is, you can tell what decision they made by the pattern of their brain activity. So what this says is that the decision to add or subtract, you can predict what it is 4 seconds before the person themselves has claimed that I made that decision. In other words, the consciousness post-dates the decision. So do you understand? This has been done many times since, and we can now predict with substantial accuracy up to 10 seconds before somebody is conscious of having made a decision. What this means is you did not make that decision, at least consciously, that it was made in your brain and then reflected on your consciousness later. So the experiments that do this show the same thing over and over and over again, that your unconscious is driving what you do, and then your consciousness just tells you afterwards that you thought you made a decision, but it was already made, okay? 6 seconds, and it can go up longer. And you're all conscious of having done stuff that you did do consciously. When you drive, for example, when I drive home from work, I do it on rote. I'm at work and I'm at home and I have no memory whatsoever of having decided to turn the wheel or do this or that. It's all programmed in our brains. More evidence that consciousness is a physical phenomenon. There's a lot of it. For example, if you split somebody's brain, which happens by accident or sometimes in the treatment of epilepsy, their consciousness changes. So they can actually see something with their right eye, which will register in the left part of the brain, and they will not be conscious of having seen it. And yet they know it somehow in their brain. We have all these bizarre lesions and diseases in the brain that affect your consciousness and your decision-making power. We have, for example, Cotard syndrome, where patients feel that they don't even exist as entities, that they don't have a consciousness. Alien hand syndrome, where you have a hand and you don't think it belongs to you. And when it moves, you say, well, I didn't move it, so something else is moving it. We have the effect of anesthesia, that you could give people consciousness and take it away simply by giving them a drug. To me, that's almost intellectual evidence that consciousness is a physical phenomenon. We can remove it and restore it simply by giving people chemicals in their brain. And we can produce conscious intentions, like the desire to lick your lips, by stimulating part of your brain. So if you put if you're operating on a patient and you stimulate part of their brain, it'll go like that. And you say, well, why did you do that? They'll say, because I chose to lick my lips. But if they didn't choose to lick their lips, what happens is there's a certain part of their brain you can apply electricity to that makes them do that. So your feeling that you made a decision to do something can be changed by various kinds of experiments. Do you have Ouija boards in India where people? There's this thing called a Ouija board where people put their hands on a little marker and there's letters on the board and you ask it questions and it moves around and gives you answers like, you're going to die next week or am I going to get married, and it'll spell out yes. And people think, well, I didn't move that. And yet it's clearly that they did, right? So in this case, people think that they're not making conscious decisions, but they are. In a case like this, people think they're making conscious decisions, but they're not. I mean, there are many, many experiments that have been summarized in many books where you can change people's ideas of whether or not they're agents that are deciding to do something by doing physical manipulations of the brain. So if this is all true, if our consciousness is merely a reflection of what has already happened in our brains beforehand, and is determined by the laws of physics, what this means is that our sense of agency and free will is an illusion. That when we go into a restaurant, that when we decide to choose something, we could not have chosen otherwise. When a criminal decides to pull a trigger on a gun or beat somebody up, they could not have chosen to do anything. In fact, every single act of our lives, we had no choice about how to do that because it all comes from our brain. And our brain reflects our genes and our environment and what impinges on our brain. Now, there's some misconceptions about this that I want to clear up in a minute, right here. So let's say you've accepted my proposition that you don't have free will. We're all just robots and marionettes on the strings of our genes and our environment. What does that mean? Well, when somebody realizes that, their first reaction is to reject it. A very famous physicist, Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize, and he's a determinist and an atheist. And I gave this lecture in front of him, and he said, do you mean to tell me that I don't really make decisions? And I said, yeah, that's what I'm trying to tell you. And he says, I don't believe it, not for a minute. Now, he's a really smart guy, and he's a physicist, and he's a determinist, but he has a feeling that's so strong that he makes choices that he simply could not accept what I was trying to tell him. And yet you have to accept it because our brains operate in a deterministic fashion. But there are some misconceptions about free will that I want to clear up. First of all, belief in determinism makes you apathetic. This is a very common reason why people reject determinism. I mean, here's E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist, who says, without belief in free will, the mind imprisoned by fatalism would slow and deteriorate, right? Why get out of bed in the morning if everything you do is already been determined. Well, we don't feel that's true. That's one reason we get out of bed in the morning. But we also get out of bed in the morning because we're evolved organisms that have evolved to wake up. But this is not true, because people that are hidebound, strict determinists like myself, I don't believe in free will, and yet I don't think my mind is slowing and deteriorating, except with age. I don't lay in bed in the morning and say, oh God, why should I get out of bed because I'm a determinist? We have a feeling that we are actors in our lives, and this is what motivates it. So this idea that if people don't believe in free will, they're going to start becoming fatalists is wrong. It's like the idea that without God, societies cannot function well. It's just not borne out by the evidence. Belief in determinism makes you cheat and act badly. Why not? I mean, if you don't bear the consequences, if there's no moral responsibility, why would you behave morally in any way? And Dan Dennett, he's a compatibilist, so he's a determinist, but he believes in a form of free will. He's one of the prime exponents of this theory. It says that he at Erasmus, share the doctrine that free will is an illusion, that doctrine, the belief that free will is an illusion, which is what I'm trying to tell you in this lecture, is likely to have profoundly unfortunate social consequences if not rebutted forcefully. This is one reason why people oppose free will, not just that it causes malaise and fatalism, but because it causes bad things to happen in society, because a society full of determinists is going to be a society of criminals. Well, that's wrong too. I don't believe that for a minute. I know a lot of people who are determinists, me and Robert Sapolsky, for example, and we're not criminals. I've never been arrested, maybe once in my life, but that was for picketing the South African embassy during apartheid. So that was a good act, not a bad one. So, belief in determinism absolves us of responsibility. That's another Dan Dennett claim. If nobody is responsible, then not only should the prisons be empty, but no contract is valid, mortgages are abolished. You cannot preserve law and order without a concept of responsibility. Well, this is wrong too, because as I said, you can be responsible, but you don't have to be morally responsible. You can have a concept of responsibility that is meaningful in our society and will help society remain smoothly. We can hold people to account for things that they did. For one thing, if somebody does bad stuff, they're likely to do it again. And so we have to worry about that, and we have to do something about that as society. We don't let people off scot-free for their bad actions for three reasons that I'll talk to you. Determinism means that everything is predictable, which is pretty much true. But it doesn't seem that way. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. My claim is that this is not due to the fact that determinism is wrong, but that we don't have enough knowledge of how the world works or how atoms interact to be able to predict what happens. With the exception of quantum mechanics, yes, everything is predictable. Certainly on the macro level, when you play a game of pool, every shot is in principle predictable. It's just that we will always lack the knowledge to be able to make these kinds of predictions. Okay? So you can be surprised at stuff because we have imperfect knowledge. Determinism doesn't take into account quantum mechanics, which is fundamentally, at least to most people's conception, indeterministic. So if our choices are based on quantum mechanical phenomena in the brain, then maybe we could have chosen otherwise. Maybe some electron in one of your neurons underwent some quantum tunneling and led us to choose the salad instead of the French fries. Well, that's possible, although physicists tell me that on the level of neuronal activity, this is unlikely. But that still doesn't give you free will. All it does is it means you could have made a different decision, but it wasn't up to you as an actor to do that because you don't control the movement of electrons in your brain. So this doesn't save free will, even if there is quantum mechanics. It just means that your consciousness, that decisions can be different, but it's not due to anything that you're responsible for. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about free will. If everything is determined, you cannot change somebody's mind, okay? Well, the answer to that is simple. You take a dog, a nice friendly dog, and it comes up to you to be petted, then you kick it, right? And then every time that dog does that, you kick it again. Well, what's going to happen? After a while, the dog is going to stop coming up to you, and it's going to become afraid of you, even though its behavior is deterministic. Why is this? Because our brains are programmable. We have in our heads evolved brains that can take in signals from the environment and use those signals through a computational process to behave adaptively. And in a way, adaptively, I mean to facilitate the spread of our genes. That dog, by becoming scared, is simply acting on its own computer program that if you associate a human being with pain, you're going to avoid that human being in the future. The dog didn't make a conscious decision to do that. It's just reacting to a program that it has in its brain. And in exactly the same way, we can change anybody else's mind. So I'm up here trying to change your minds, and I'm frequently asked, well, if I'm really a determinist, why do I bother giving lectures like this? Because you're already determined to believe what you want to believe anyway. And my answer is, I can change your minds. Everybody knows that changing your minds involves changing people's environments by giving them new information that goes into their brain and rewires their computer programs. And that can affect how they behave in the future. Now, this leads to a sort of maddening eternal regress, because the fact that I'm up here trying to convince you that free will is an illusion is itself determined by me. So that though I might be able to change your minds, what I'm telling you has been determined by my own environment and by my own genes and other people talking to me, and that article I read in PNAS. But that article I read in PNAS was also determined to be written by Anthony Cashmore. And so it all goes back to the Big Bang and this sort of eternal regress of causes. But what I do want to say is, you can change people's minds. And it's useful to do that. And if you believe that it's adaptive for them to do something, then you can tell them, for example, if you want to accomplish X, do this. And they might do that. So, that is completely compatible with determinism. I mean, here's David, a reader of my website, who wrote me and said, there's no point trying to fix society when things are simply fated to happen. Okay? It's an insane argument to say that we can fix society, and how can punishment be a deterrent? And he's just dead wrong about this. He doesn't understand that computers can be rewired and changed by what happens to their environment, and we can affect people's behavior by what we tell them. And finally, this is the worst of all arguments, and it's frequently made by religious people like Paul Davies, who's a physicist in Arizona. Even if the world is determinist and free will is an illusion, it may be a fiction worth maintaining. Now, this is a horrible thing to tell people, because it tells them that even though something is true scientifically, let's pretend that it's not true, because there's severe problems with accepting it's true. This is the same thing that people say about evolution, by the way, that we have to pretend that evolution didn't happen, because if everybody believed in evolution, they'd start acting like animals, and we'd have rape and pillage and all kinds of horrible things. So it's a fiction worth maintaining. This is Dan Dennett's view as well, that if we tell people that they don't have free will, society's going to go to pieces. Okay. So, to maintain the fiction, a whole school of philosophy has arisen called compatibilism that tries to say that, yes, things are determined, that we have no free choice, but nevertheless we have a form of free will anyway. Because you want to be able to tell people, yes, you have free will, because if you don't tell them that, then they start becoming criminals, or they can't get out of bed in the morning. Now, how does this work? I mean, what form of free will can you have that's compatible with the purely deterministic laws of physics? Well, first of all, you have free will if you don't make your decision under completely coercive circumstances. So if somebody puts a gun to your head and says, give me your wallet, you give them your wallet, right? And that's coercive. And people say, well, I didn't have free will. I had to give them my wallet. What I'm trying to say is that there's nothing different from somebody holding a gun to your head and telling you to do something than from your neurons, which hold little guns to your brain and force you to do things that, everything that you do. Sam Harris expressed this in his book, Free Will. There isn't materially anything more coercive about giving money at gunpoint than drinking milk when you're thirsty. Both of these are reflecting of the laws of physics that are acting on your brain. They're both equally coercive. We just think of this as more coercive because we don't understand how our brain works and how it mandates what we do. Number two, so that's not a good form of free will. Our complicated brains have evolved to take in a lot of information. This is Dan Dennett's view of what free will is, that we have free will because we have to absorb a lot of information before we just make a so-called decision. And this is not a form of free will either, because all it means is that we have a very complicated computer inside of our head because we're highly evolved cerebrally. And if complicated decisions that are based on lots of information are indications of free will, then this computer, Deep Blue, which is a chess-playing computer, has free will, because it has to take in a lot of information about the moves of a chess player. And this computer can defeat the world's grandmasters now. Does this thing have free will? Because it has to take in a lot of information and make complicated decisions? No, it doesn't. No more than our brain does the same thing in an infinitely more complex and hard to understand matter. Free will is the view of the circumstances have been different. You could have made a different decision and acted on it. I agree with that. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about identical circumstances and making different decisions. And free will represents the decisions that people make when they are not mentally ill. It's what well-behaved people do, cognizant of punishment and reward decide to do. This isn't free will in the sense that most people accept it either, because whether or not you know or accept the idea of punishment or reward, or accept society's standards of what's right or wrong, that itself is determined by your environment and your genes. So whether or not you behave, according to society's dictates or not, is not something you can choose to do. So this violates the notion of yourself as an agent or not. You don't have any choice about whether you're mentally ill or not, okay? So what I'm trying to say is the distinction between compatibilism and incompatibilism is a purely semantic one. If you want to call the programming of our brains free will, fine. But this violates what people really think of as free will, the idea that at any one moment they could have chosen differently. You remember the early slide showing that most people think that we live in a world which there's forms of behavioral that are not determined by the laws of physics. Moreover, those definitions of incompatibilism, free will, that I just gave you, are incompatible with each other. Every philosopher has a different way of defining free will, but their commonality is that we all have it, because the underlying proposition is if we don't think we have free will, then the world falls apart. Okay. This is Sam Harris saying what the real problem with compatibilism is. It ignores the very source of our belief in free will, the feeling that we have conscious agency and make a decision. We feel that we are the authors of our thoughts. We feel that we are the authors of our decisions and our actions, and this is the only reason why there is even a problem of free will worth talking about. So all these the compatibilist definitions violate this notion that people have and this very deep feeling we have that we are the authors of our actions. And again, I'm trying to tell you that that feeling is wrong. You may feel that you decide what to do and that you can make a different decision, but that is wrong, okay? And he says that compatibilism amounts to nothing more than assertion of the creed. A puppet is free as long as he loves his strings. We have our strings, we just have to accept that. Okay, so why do people promote compatibilism so vigorously? I've already told you, we don't want people disabling themselves with bad science. I think this is a very serious issue. The view that prevents people from accepting determinism is simply that it will be bad for society if we accept this scientific truth. It reminds me of what happened when Darwinism came around in 1859, and the wife of the Bishop of Worcester was told about Darwin's theory of evolution, that and that it was implicit that we were descended from the apes. And the bishop's wife said, "My dear, descended from the apes, let us hope that this is not true. But if it is true, let us pray that it not become generally known." Okay, and this is the view that philosophers like Dan Dennett have about free will. They actually believe that our behaviors are determined, but they don't want everybody to know it, because they think that if we do know it, that there are very horrible social consequences that ensue. I'm not going to go over this very long. Compatibilism is very similar to the way that sophisticated theologians, in particular Christianity, like Heidegger or Kierkegaard or others, act. There's a lot of similarities. They redefine the notion of free will. Compatibilists will call free will something different from what most people believe. They both think that if you don't believe in their concept, that society will be wrecked. On one hand, God, on the other hand, free will. both sets humans aside as special. Many philosophers think that only humans have free will. And many theologians think that only humans are the special objects of God's attention. Both theologians and philosophers think that either God or free will is necessary to sustain society as a viable proposition. I won't go through these. Both of them criticize science. This is one reason why I don't like this form of compatibilistic philosophy, because it is implicitly anti-science. It rejects what we know to be scientific truth, which is determinism, because we don't like the consequences of that acceptance. And so you see that advocates of compatibilist free will are always saying stuff like science gives us the wrong answer. They're always doing down science, in the same way that theologians would do down evolution or do down atheism. Okay, now I will claim that there are advantages to accepting what I've told you, both personal and societal. First of all, what I've told you is true. There is no credible argument you can give me that our brains are somehow exempt from the laws of physics. There's no evidence that there is some part of the brain and no physical law which could say that simply by thinking about something in a non-materialistic way, we can affect the way our brains work, which is the proposition that enables free will. So it's true. And it's always good to accept what's scientifically true and then deal with it. It's better to accept the truth than pretend that it's not true, because then we can proceed to improve society on the basis of what's true. It gets rid of this libertarian free will of religion. I've talked to a lot of students, and it's implicit in my talk so far that I don't think religion is a really good thing for the world to have. And if you get rid of the idea of free will, it gets rid of a lot of the bad parts of religion. For example, that you're going to go to hell if you make the wrong choice. You don't have a choice to make. It's already determined, probably when you're born, whether you're going to accept Jesus or not as your Savior. There's no free will defense for the existence of evil. We have to accept evils as simply an inevitable result of the physical universe and the workings of natural selection. And lo and behold, we are suddenly liberated from having to demonize whole classes of human beings for having made the wrong choice. The more we learn about science, the more we learn that homosexuality is not something that people choose to do or be. If you ask a gay person, they will say, I knew from when I was very young that I was attracted to people of my own sex. But for the longest time, those people have been killed or demonized, and ISIS is still throwing them off of roofs because they were supposed to have made the wrong choice. Well, if you realize they didn't make a choice, then you don't punish them that way anymore. And finally, and this is the most important thing I have to say, determinism has very serious implications for our criminal justice system and for our notions of moral responsibility, politics, and personal behavior. And that's what I really want to finish by talking about. But first, the personal advantages of determinism. If you realize that you could not have behaved other than the way you did, it's liberating in some ways. And I realized this when I was thinking about an old romance I had with a really nice girlfriend. I said, why didn't I do something different? Why did I lose this really nice girlfriend? And then all of a sudden I was a determinist, and I realized I couldn't have done anything else. And that eliminates you having to constantly kick yourself for having behaved in the wrong way, because you had no choice about what you did. So you free yourself from recriminations and regrets that you would have if you thought that you could have behaved otherwise. So you don't beat yourself up. It reduces your egotism. If you think that you're smart because you did something that made you smart, well, you didn't. Whether you were going to be smart or dumb or a criminal or not, that was determined completely by your genes and your environment. You had no choice in that. And so if you're famous and head of an institute or a Nobel laureate, it takes some of the wind out of your sails, as it should, because you're not responsible for being either a very good person or a very bad person, because you don't choose that. It makes you more compassionate towards other people. I wonder if, in America we have the view amongst many rich people that the poor people simply made the wrong choice. That poor people are poor simply not because they were born to be poor or their genes or their environment made them to be poor, but they simply didn't work hard enough, or they didn't go to the right school, or they made some bad decision that wound up making them poor. Well, that's not the way it works. They're poor because they were determined to be poor from before they were born. And when you realize that, then it gains you a certain amount of sympathy towards these people. You cannot blame them for their own fate anymore, just like you can't blame anybody for their own fate. It gives you a greater feeling of unanimity with humanity. This is at least my personal reaction to being a determinist. So this doesn't turn you into a criminal or somebody with malaise. It has these salubrious results. But the most important thing is crime and punishment. Now, the law, at least in the United States, and I'm sure in India, without knowing anything about the Indian legal system, I'm sure that criminals have mitigating factors that will get them off punishment if you can show that those factors help determine their behavior. For example, if somebody is insane and they commit a criminal act, in America you will be called not guilty by reason of insanity, because it is thought that you could not choose whether you committed a criminal act or not. Okay, John Hinckley, who tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan, was not guilty by reason of insanity. He was put in a mental hospital for many years and was just released. So there's lots of mitigating factors that the law already recognizes, that if there were things that made you behave the way you did, and there's various forms of these things, childhood abuse, there's what's called the Twinkie defense, which is very famous. The guy that assassinated the mayor of San Francisco, he said, well, I'm not guilty because I ate a lot of Twinkies. You don't know what Twinkies are probably, but it's an American junk food. It's worse than a gulab jamun in terms of sugar. If you eat too much sugar, the guy said, well, it just made me go crazy and I killed somebody. And so, I mean, the law didn't recognize that, but it does recognize these other forms of incapacitation, which means that if the law recognizes that there were factors that made you behave the way you did and that you couldn't have behaved otherwise, then you get treated differently. Well, I will maintain that we're all like that. Some of us more obviously than others, but any criminal is exactly like a criminal that's insane because their brain is controlling what they do, whether or not they're recognized as mentally ill. And if the belief that actually we can choose whether or not to be criminals leads to things like the death penalty. I guess India still has the death penalty, is that correct? The death penalty is by and large predicated on the notion that you should die because you made the wrong choice, right? I mean, in general, that it is. But if you couldn't made the wrong choice, you shouldn't have been killed. We still have it in America. Enlightened countries don't have the death penalty, so in this respect, both America and India are enlightened. This is Cecil Clayton. This is a scan of his brain. He killed somebody in Missouri. He was mentally retarded. You can see he's missing this frontal lobe of his brain because he worked in a sawmill and had an accident. It eliminated that. It caused him to behave erratically, to be paranoid, to have rages, and he killed somebody. What did the judge do? Well, normally you would say, well, he had no choice in that. His brain made him do it, just like every other criminal. But he was executed. Why was he executed? Because he was able to say, yes, I did something wrong. And that's all it takes in America for you to be killed. Because when you say, I knew I did something wrong, that's equivalent to Americans to saying, I could have behaved otherwise. But there's a difference between knowing you did something that violates the norms of society and being able to have chosen otherwise, okay? So this guy, unfortunately, was executed for, there are people that are so retarded that when they're given their last meal, they save their dessert for later because they think they're coming back. I mean, that's how mentally incapacitated they are, and yet they're killed. Why are they killed? As a form of retribution. So there's three reasons why we should punish people for, even in a world of determinism, we should still hold people as responsible for their actions and we should punish them for three reasons. First of all, for sequestration. If somebody does something bad, they're liable to do it again. And so we need to put them away until we're assured that they are reformed. So that's one reason. And there are some people who can never be reformed because they're habitual criminals. Second of all, for rehabilitation. If somebody can be rehabilitated, like a child molester, which are very hard to rehabilitate, or anybody else, we should put them away in an institution where they will get the kind of help they need so they can be released into society. I mean, if you can fix somebody, like if you can fix a car that's broken, then why not put it back on the street again if it's no longer a danger to society? And the same thing with people. And finally, punishment for deterrence. We want people to know that if you do something wrong, that you're going to go to jail. And the way to do that is to put people in jail who do something wrong, because then you see that that happens. So these are the three valid reasons for punishing people, even in a world of deterrence, because they help reform people and they help society in general. You cannot punish them because they made the wrong choice, because I've tried to convince you that people do not make the wrong choice because they cannot make any choice at all. So these are the three reasons we should do this. But the way we should imprison people and the way we would treat them if they're convicted of a crime is completely different. My view is, for example, that you would determine someone's guilt or innocence by a judge or jury. But the treatment for that person should be determined by scientists and psychologists and sociologists, not by a court. And this also leads to just world belief. You don't hold people accountable for their station in life. Okay. How do we fix the system of punishment? Well, I think we should do what Norway does. Do you know Anders Breivik? You've probably heard of him. He was a sort of neo-Nazi. And in Norway, he went to a children's camp with a rifle and he killed like 60 people. And he was unrepentant. Here he is in court giving the Nazi salute. In America, he would have been executed. In India, he would have been executed. What do they do in Norway? They put him in jail and it gave him the maximum sentence, which was 20 years. That's the most that you can be sentenced in Norway. And then after 20 years, you're evaluated by a team of psychologists that determine whether or not you're a danger to society. If you still are, you give it another 5 years, and every 5 years you're evaluated. There's no sense in putting somebody in prison forever if it's possible to rehabilitate them. What would be the sense of that? There's the kind of cell he has. He has a nice computer. He cooks his own meals. He has a DVD player. He has a treadmill he can work out on. You know, he's been deprived of his freedom, but he hasn't been severely punished for having made a bad decision. Now, you think, well, what's the effect of this? The recidivism rate in Norway, where this is the way that people are punished, and this, by the way, is also true in Sweden and Denmark, which are the enlightened countries, is 20%. If a criminal commits a crime, the chances that that person will be arrested again is only 1 in 5. And the incarceration rate, the percentage of the population that's in jail, is 0.075%. Compare this to the United States, which has a less enlightened penal system, believes in a free will sense that a criminal had a choice about whether they did the act, and by God, we punish people pretty severely. I'll show you how in a minute. The recidivism rate is almost 4 times higher. If you go to American prison and you're released, the chance that you will be arrested again is nearly 80%. And the chance that the proportion of the population is incarcerated is 0.7%, which is almost 1 out of 100 people, okay? So it seems like this kind of punishment system, which is enlightened, is actually working. It causes less criminality, or it's associated with less criminality, and the rate at which criminals come back to prison is much lower. And this is also true for Sweden and Denmark. So you cannot make the argument that coddling a criminal like this, putting them in a cell and giving them rehabilitation and giving them a decent bed and a DVD player and a computer is going to make them, you know, it's not a deterrent. It's going to make people more likely to be criminals because the statistics doesn't show that. I believe that all penal systems should be run the way the Norwegian penal system is, but they're not. This is a prison cell in India. I just took it off of Wikipedia. Has anybody been in prison here? I think this is pretty accurate from what has been described to me. And that's a pretty horrible place to be. Same thing in the United States. It looks a little better, but this is the SHU. This is maximum security prison. There's no light. You have a bed and a little toilet. You're allowed some books, but you don't have DVD player. You can't cook or anything. And people go insane in this kind of prison. They kill themselves because it makes them mentally ill to be sequestered like this. This kind of punishment is not, in my view, warranted under the view that a criminal has no choice. This kind of punishment is punitive. It's retributive. It presumes that prisoners made the wrong choice, and by God, we got to put them in bad circumstances to punish them for what they did. Okay, so to wind up, what are the modest proposals I would make based on determinism? First of all, we replace the notion of free will with this statement: my decision was caused by internal forces that I do not understand. Instead of saying I made a choice, you just say, well, I made a decision, or I appeared to make a decision, but I didn't really decide to do that. It's caused by forces I don't understand. Maybe someday we will understand them. Get rid of the notion of moral responsibility and just replace it with the notion of responsibility. That will lead to the reform of the penal system. And finally, this view of determinism leads some really interesting questions that can be investigated by both philosophers and biologists. First of all, once we accept that determinism is true, and I hope you agree with me now, you're not going to agree with me right now. You're going to have to go home and think about this. And some people think about it a long time, and some people never come around to the view. I think they're wrong, but this is something that I'm not going to convince you of in an hour. But what are the effects of that if we accept it on the system of punishment and rewards? How should we change society? And we should change society in view of the fact that people do not make decisions. This is a study which includes both ethics and empirical work on jurisprudence. Does moral responsibility mean anything more than responsibility? What does the idea of morality really mean? Well, that's a philosophical question, but it has to be rethought of in terms of the fact that people cannot choose to do good things or bad things. How far ahead can we predict decisions before they're made consciously? We can do it up to 10 seconds now for simple binary decisions, but this is with a very crude form of brain scanning, because fMRI, if you know how it works, is very crude. It just measures oxygen flow to certain regions of the brain. Suppose we could actually put wires in all our neurons. Maybe we could predict what somebody would do, like, a year in advance. We don't know, but that's something that science is responsibility. And what are the genetic and environmental factors that affect our choices, and how do they impinge upon our brain? And we all know people's personalities and how they got developed by their environmental circumstances. Somebody becomes a certain way and acts a certain way because they've experienced different environments over their life. We all know people like this, okay? And this is the last thing I want to talk about. There's the very first slide I said, Samuel Johnson, that all experience tells us that we have free will, and all theory, and by that he meant science, tells us that we don't. Then why do we feel that we have free will? I mean, if the scientific fact is that we cannot decide what to do, why do we wake up every morning thinking, well, what should I have for breakfast? Cornflakes or utapams or whatever. Why do we have a feeling of agency? Well, one possibility is it's just an accident of the way our brains are formed. It's an epiphenomenon. But there's also evolutionary explanations, and I don't know which ones of these are right. For example, natural selection might make you feel like you are making choices because it helps us live in societies with other people. If we think that somebody else, for example, made a choice to do something good or bad, then we might be more inclined to punish them or reward them, which might make our little group of people behave more harmoniously. So it could be an adaptive result of natural selection. I don't know. Second of all, it could be, these things are not mutually exclusive, it could tell our brains whether we're doing something that came out of our own brain or something that happens to us. For example, suppose my arm starts shaking like this. Well, I'd want to know, is this something that registered in my consciousness, or has some animal got a hold of my arm and is shaking it like that? And it's important to know, to distinguish between what you do that arises from your brain, and that could be through the conscious idea that you're actually deciding to do something, or whether somebody else is doing something to you. Because what's adaptive to behave is different in those two situations. And finally, perhaps you try harder to achieve things if you think you have agency. If we really do think that we're making choices, and we're rewarded for making those choices by being told that we're really good people and we worked hard, or we'll be punished if we don't make them, then maybe evolution has fostered this feeling of conscious agency because societies, it's not really group selection, but those individuals that have this feeling might strive harder because of the rewards that come from it. And I'll finish just this quote from Albert Einstein, because he's the smartest guy in the world, and everybody knows that anything Einstein ever said has to be true. Well, it turned out that Albert Einstein did not believe in free will either, and he made this famous quote, "If the moon, which is an object that does not have consciousness, in the act of completing its eternal rotation around the Earth, were given self-consciousness, it would be fully convinced that it was going around the Earth of its own accord. So would a being endowed with higher insight and more perfect intelligence," and by that he means human beings, "watching man in his doings," well, a Martian, for example, "smile about man's illusion that he was acting according to his own free will." Einstein, being a physicist, did not believe this occurred. Thank you.